Thank you, Christopher. I'm clearly delighted to be able to read Peter. He's a very good friend of mine, to read his paper. I've known him as an independent scholar, as I am, over 7 or 8 years now. He was just starting his book, preparation for his book on the Black Prince's chevauchés. His unique take on the chevauché was to actually get on his walking boots and walk the full length of it over a period of years, and in digestible chunks, I should add. And his book makes fascinating reading. He's done a similar work on Agincourt and walked the route of Henry V's army, and there is a little guide, walking guide to that as well. So brings an exciting new take from a non-professional for a professional audience. I know Peter regrets not being here. His wife Jo's poor health issues at the moment made it actually impractical and impossible, but I hope you would all join me in just wishing Jo a swift return to good health. The Black Prince in France, 1355-56, brigand or strategist. Back in 2005, I embarked on a personal project to retrace on foot the Black Prince's campaigns of 1355 and 56, which took him from Bordeaux down to the Mediterranean and back, and then north to the Loire before turning south for home, defeating John II of France in the fields to the southeast of Poitiers. My objectives were to attempt to resolve some of the issues of the uncertainties associated with the itineraries, set out in detail for 1355 in Geoffrey Le Baker's Chronicon and the Eulogium Historiarum for 1356, and to see what the terrain could tell us of the conduct of operations. One of the beauties of walking is the time for reflection, and the more I saw on the ground and the more I read, the more I became convinced that there was much more to these two campaigns than brigandage and a search for personal enrichment. Let me start with a brief summary of the campaigns. The truce which had endured since the fall of Calais in 1347 and the intervening devastation wrought by the Black Death, the truce was due to expire in the summer of 1355. Aquitaine was then facing incursions by John II's lieutenant in the Languedoc, John, Count of Armagnac. And Edward III sent the Black Prince with around 3,000 men to Bordeaux in the late summer. This force was matched with a similar number of Gascons, and in early October, this army set off from Bordeaux on a classic chevauchée. And significantly, for the first time, an English army crossed the Garonne and continuing to the Mediterranean near Narbonne. The army returned to Aquitaine in early December, having inflicted considerable damage in the Languedoc. The winter and spring were devoted to consolidating the Anglo-Gascon position, and a number of lords and towns, unsure where their best interests lay, came across to the English cause. In addition, further archers were raised in England, and in August 1356, the Black Prince set off northwards again, this time with around 6,000 men, leaving 3,000 men to defend Aquitaine. He hoped to join forces with the Duke of Lancaster, who had landed in Normandy with around 1,200 men. His objective was first of all to find the Count of Poitiers, known to be near Bourges. But to join with Lancaster required one or other of them to cross the Loire. The river was in flood after a wet summer, and Lancaster was turned back at the Pont de Cé near Angers. The Black Prince found the Loire impassable and turned for Aquitaine, eventually joining King John in battle and returning subsequently to Bordeaux with the king as his captive. These two campaigns of 1355 and 1356 have often been characterised as simple brigandage, without any strategic objectives. The French historian J.M. Tourneur-Aumont, writing in 1940, summarised these points of view summarised the point of view of a number of historians who had concluded that the campaigns had never followed a strategic plan intended to achieve any lasting results, and that the sole aim was devastation and pillage for their own sakes. His conclusion was, quote, "Let us not talk of forces serving the English crown. It was simply a matter of brigandage." He was by no means alone in holding this view, and Hewitt, 20 years later, stated, again, quote, "that this campaign lacked a strategic plan. It is largely true, but it is also a truism of all warfare in the 14th century." My contention is that the two chevauchés of 1355 and 1356 had a strategic objective, even if much of the evidence is circumstantial. Of course, Clifford Rogers, who's been a great inspiration for me, has long argued that there was a strong strategic element to the campaigns of Edward III's reign, but I want to give closer attention to these particular campaigns. It's worth taking a few moments to review why the chevauchée was such an attractive strategic option for Edward's England. France had a population around 3 times that of England, and in theory, at least, the French king could draw on a tax base around 4 times what is that of his English rival. Add to that the English reliance on external lines of communication by sea, in contrast to the French internal lines over land. Conquest and occupation, certainly without the prospect of powerful allies such as Henry V was to have in his reign, was not a realistic prospect. Chevauchés gave Edward the chance to export the war, defence being the best form of defence, and choose the time and place of operations. A letter of Edward III's during the Crécy campaign stated the objectives of such campaigns: to punish rebels against us and to comfort our friends and those faithful to us, to carry on the war as best we can to our advantage and to the loss of our enemies. If the French could be provoked into battle, then so much the better, but if not, the economic power of France could be diminished, the ability of John to continue the war weakened, and the inability of the French king to protect his subjects thrown into sharp relief. The chevauchée in the Languedoc. It is easy to see why the 1355 chevauchée has been widely characterised as brigandage, with reports of towns, farms, vineyards pillaged and burned, mills destroyed, and an account of the army returning to Aquitaine with more than 1,000 wagons full of booty. However, the Black Prince's behaviour at Carcassonne, down in the south, gives an inkling of more than a desire for loot and destruction. The poorly defended bourg, separated from the formidable cité, was exposed to looting and destruction. The inhabitants offered the prince the enormous sum of 250,000 écus to spare the bourg. His response was that he had not come for gold but for justice. He chose to destroy the bourg since, to paraphrase the chronicler, the citizens continued to fear the usurper John and did not wish to obey their legitimate lord Edward III. The political imperative took priority over financial gain, although of course there was still plunder to be taken from the bourg before the army continued on its way. The French historian Henri Denifle, writing towards the end of the 19th century, unwittingly put his finger on the objective of operations such as those of 1355. I quote, "They proposed above all to pillage and to ravage one of the richest parts of France, from where the king drew his greatest resources for waging war." The chroniclers and archives support the economic impact of the chevauchée, drawing attention to the wealth of the towns pillaged, the number of mills destroyed, the destruction of crops and vines, and of archives, so invaluable for raising of taxes. There was also the psychological impact, particularly beyond the Garonne, where the English had appeared for the first time. This impact had endured across the centuries, and as one local historian said to me, his grandfather in the 1930s would rebuke him with the words, "Don't moan, lad, you've seen nothing yet. Wait until the English army comes." The last time they'd been there was in November 1355. However, in addition to the economic aspect, we should not lose sight of the fact that on at least 3 occasions, near Toulouse, Carbonne, and Gimont, the prince arrayed his men only to see Armagnac decline battle. Sir John Wingfield. Is Miss Dr. Alban here? It's a Norwich church. We should all know that. It's a lovely, lovely tomb. The primacy of the economic importance of the operations of late 1355 can be seen in a letter written at Christmas by Sir John Wingfield, governor of the Prince's business, to the Bishop of Winchester, who at the time was Treasurer of England and was to become Chancellor the following year. He estimated that the regions devastated contributed more than half of the royal revenues raised in France. He went on to say that this estimate was based on documents found in the houses of receivers of taxes. The figure of half the revenues was certainly an exaggeration, but the point is that the emphasis was on the economic aspect of the chevauchée rather than on the plunder taken. It is also surely indicative of the importance attached to the economic aspect that in the chaos of the assault on a town, men were tasked to seize the archives. In the same vein, there is evidence of archives and charters being deliberately destroyed in Limoux, Carbonne, ou Veillant, with the obvious objective of undermining the collection of taxes. In addition to the direct impact, we see the indirect effect of the chevauchée of the devastation in the Languedoc. As early as October, when the chevauchée was still in progress, towns such as Millau decided to keep tax revenues to restore fortifications. Meeting in March and April 1356, the estates of the Languedoc agreed to a royal request for increased taxes, but subject to the condition that the funds raised would only be used to defend the Languedoc and that the king should send the Dauphin to their aid. It's impossible to demonstrate that this was foreseen by the prince and his advisers, but it is not unreasonable to suppose that the decision to cross the Garonne near Toulouse and drive on to the Mediterranean was calculated to spread panic and confusion in a region so far spared from the horrors of the war. When the prince set off north in August 1356, his primary objective, according to a post-campaign letter, was to find the Count of Poitiers at Bourges. In the event, before the Anglo-Gascon army approached Bourges, the Count had moved north to join the king's army then near Chartres. This map shows the main route followed by the prince, but it is likely that the rear guard on the right, on your right, took a more easterly route through the Auvergne. A typical broad brush view of the campaign of 56 is that the prince conducted a classic chevauchée and, unable to cross the Loire, turned back to Bordeaux with his booty. However, a closer look at the campaign shows 3 distinct phases of operation. The advance to the river Vienne. Where's the Vienne gone? Here? Lost the line, excuse me. The second phase, the classic phase, taking him to the Cher, the river Cher, and then the final manoeuvre phase, leading up to the Battle of Poitiers. It's only after the crossing of the Vienne that banners were unfurled, and the only evidence of destruction or pillaging of towns before this date is an account of the Bishop of Périgueux, fulminating from the walls against pillagers and the possible destruction of La Chapelle-Fauchée near Brantôme. It is possible that these isolated incidents resulted from ill discipline rather than policy. There are 3 occasions up to the crossing of the Vienne which give circumstantial evidence that at this stage the prince wished to avoid combat, conscious that this would deplete his resources and, when he needed to conserve them, with his objective in view of joining the French in battle. le château de Ramfort. On Monday, 8th of August, the Prince's army rested close to the Château of Ramfort on the Dronne, 5 kilometres southeast of Brantôme. The next day he moved on this short distance to Brantôme, and the following day only 11 kilometres to Quinsac, before fording the river on the 11th of August. In 3 days he had only covered 16 kilometres, at a time when, though the pace had been leisurely, they had nonetheless covered around 15 kilometres a day. And the average overall of the expedition was 22 kilometres on a day. The obvious question, why this slow progress? An aerial map showing Brantôme and the abbey. It's a natural choke point on the route north. It stands in an oxbow bend of the Dronne, with high ground to the west and the east. The road north passed through the town, which was walled with a fortified abbey to the west. There is a narrow band of land to the east of the town at the foot of the high ground, over which a minor road now passes. But it was within range of the crossbowmen on the ramparts. Possible explanations for the pause in the vicinity of the town are the time necessary to consider an assault, the time for a reconnaissance to find another crossing place, or the time taken trying to negotiate a safe passage. The passage of the Dronne at Quinsac, significantly further north from Brantôme. An assault would probably have been within the capacity of the army, but the associated losses could not be replaced. We can discern a wider strategic view in the Prince's decision to move up the river and cross at Quinsac rather than risk resources in sacking the abbey and the town. The town of Nontron. The problem at Brantôme was immediately repeated with the crossing of the Bondiat near Nontron. The river itself was not a significant obstacle, but there is a steep descent into the valley with an escarpment 60 metres high, beyond with the fortified town and its castle on a rocky spur, somewhat like an upturned boat with the bow aspects towards the line of approach. 10 years before, the town had been in the hands of the Anglo-Gascons, but now it was held by the French. It seems, however, that the Prince was permitted safe passage, since in a letter dated 20 May 1357, Yitier de Meignac was dispossessed of all his goods in the lordship of Nontron and elsewhere in the Viscounty for having delivered the castle of Nontron into the hands of the enemy. Again, we can read into this peaceful passage of the town a wider strategic objective of moving towards the French army without sustaining losses. The third example is the crossing of the Vienne. When you're on foot and you see the route, take a huge dogleg to the west, adding more than a day's walking, you cannot help but wonder why this route was taken when, by and large, the Prince had followed a route more or less directly north. Such a route would have been better served by crossing the river at either Chabanais or Saint-Junien. Both towns had bridges over the river. Chabanais straddled the river with the bridge passing through the castle on the north bank. Saint-Junien was a little to the north of the river and the bridge, but once across the river, the army would have had to pass within bowshot of the town walls. The decision was to move to the west and cross at the well-known ford of Manneau, adding 50 kilometres to the route, but avoiding the risks and losses of forcing a crossing at a defended town. After crossing of the Vienne and the unfurling of banners, the campaign became one of classic chevauchée operations, with widespread destruction. Nevertheless, this is a further example of the Prince eschewing an assault in favour of conserving resources for a possible future set-piece battle. The defences of the town of Châteauroux were in a pitiful state, and Anglo-Gascons had no difficulty in entering the town. The castle, however, was an entirely different affair. The defences were assessed, and it was concluded that the success of the attack was not certain, and there would be a significant cost in terms of losses of men. A French chronicler writing, it has to be said some years after the events, attributed this decision to the prince's desire to conserve his resources for battle. Only 5 days later, however, we see a change of approach. As the prince moved north, the French army was gathering, and King John sent out the lords of Craon and Boucicaut to reconnoitre the progress of the Anglo-Gascons. After a series of skirmishes, first in favour of the French, but with the advantage finally falling to the prince's men, the French withdrew into the castle of Romorantin. The town and the castle bailey fell without much resistance, but the remaining defenders took refuge in the keep. The prince settled down to besiege and assault the keep, which fell 4 days later. In all, the prince had stayed at Romorantin for 6 days. The explanation for this change of approach seems to be that the prince initially thought King John was only 25 miles away, and that he could possibly draw the French army towards him to relieve Romorantin. In fact, John was still north of the Loire. The choices for the prince, when he appreciated that the French were not close at hand but appeared to be moving westward towards Tours, were to remain where he was, in the hope that the French would come to him, to try to cross the Loire and join Lancaster for the safety of Aquitaine, or to set off for Tours in search of the French army. Staying put was unattractive. Provisioning would become increasingly difficult, and the prince would cede the initiative to the enemy. A direct return home would be the obvious move if his concern were to preserve the gains of the chevauchés to date. We know from the prince's own account that while at Romorantin, intelligence indicated that a crossing of the Loire would not be possible. But still hoping that Lancaster might find a crossing further west, he elected to set off for Tours. If the aim of the prince was pillage, then surely he would not have set off for Tours. However, Hewitt's view was that, quote, the best way from Romorantin to Bordeaux lay in going west along the Cher and at some suitable point turning south. Even a cursory glance at the map shows that this is nonsense. A quicker escape could have been achieved by either retracing the route taken in the previous month or cutting southwest to pick up the route from Poitiers to Bordeaux. In either case, he could have kept well ahead of King John. Indeed, if he had marched at only the average distance covered on March days since leaving Bergerac, he would have reached Poitiers on the 13th of September, well ahead of King John, who arrived at what was to be the battlefield only on Sunday the 18th of September. If escape had been his aim, he could have moved much faster. Escape would have been the logical action for a brigand determined to preserve his gains. An advance towards Tours is much more consistent with a leader maintaining his aim of battle. On leaving Romorantin, the campaign now entered its third phase, that of manoeuvre, as the prince sought to maintain the delicate balance between keeping the opportunity for battle alive without becoming trapped. The greatest risk for the prince was to be trapped by the three rivers. In the funnels formed between the Loire and the Cher, then a little further south the Cher and the Indre, then with his back to the Creuse. He remained 4 days at Montlouis, moved on to avoid the first trap, 2 nights at Montbazon to escape the second, and 1 night near the Creuse at La Haye, now named Descartes. He then remained 3 days at Châtellerault, and when intelligence reached him that John would be moving between Chauvigny and Poitiers on the 17th of September, he set off to intercept the French, falling on the French rearguard. At long last, the two armies were in contact. The following day, he turned towards the French army, now some 5 miles southwest of Poitiers in the fields near the Abbey of Noyers. The Sunday was spent in preparation and negotiation, and on the Monday, the prince achieved his great victory, taking John prisoner. None of the prince's actions since leaving Romorantin are consistent with a brigand fleeing the enemy to preserve or to conserve his ill-gotten gains. The opportunities to escape, right up until the eve of the battle, were many, but none of them were taken. To conclude, pillage and booty to enrich both the crown and individuals of all ranks were clearly important elements of the prince's chevauchés of 1355 and 56, but the documentary and circumstantial evidence points to prime aims of undermining French power and seeking to bring them to battle. A fundamental principle of war is maintenance of the aim. The prince clearly understood and applied this principle. Thank you.